This is Toby Greany from the London Centre for Leadership in Learning at the Institute of Education, talking about an article that I've written for the London Review of Education entitled More Fragmented and Yet More Networked. And it's exploring the changing role of local authorities in England under the coalition government that ran from 2010 until 2015. Anyone who knows the context of England will know that schools in England on OECD PISA terms were relatively autonomous compared to other school systems around the world up until 2010. Each school has its own governing body and is very much responsible for decisions around budgets, staffing, the curriculum and so on. And yet, up until 2010, most schools sat under the aegis of the democratically elected local authority, which had statutory powers to both oversee those schools and ensure efficient, effective running in terms of use of financial resources, for example, but also to intervene where there was a concern around school performance. And then in 2010, the coalition government, which is a centre-right government, introduced the Academies Act, which gave all schools, particularly those that were higher performing, the opportunity to choose to come out of the local authority arrangement and become academies. And this meant that they were funded directly from central government and they had increased autonomies or freedoms, as the coalition called it. For example, not to apply the national curriculum, they didn't have to employ qualified teachers. So by 2014, at the time when I undertook the two case studies that I use as the basis for the argument in the article, over 4,300 of England's 21,000 schools had become academies. And this had a very seismic effect on local authorities because it reduced the budgets available to them and very much required them to reshape their role. The Coalition's white paper, published in 2010, argued that local authorities needed to become champions for children, to reshape themselves so that they could champion the needs of pupils and parents and to ensure just social justice and equity in very much autonomous, academised school systems. And what the two case studies do is they track what that looks like in the two areas that I looked at, and it compares those findings where we talked to school leaders, to what are called system leaders, leaders with designated roles to provide leadership across local networks of schools, to local authority leaders, to the inspection agency, Ofsted, and to various others, as well as detailed documentary analysis. It compares those findings to a discourse analysis that I undertook of the Coalition's policy framework and a set of 4 scenarios that I developed working with a group of local authority leaders and school leaders back in 2012, where we were trying to envisage what might the future look like as schools became academies and as the role of the local authority changed and shifted. And what emerges from that, I won't try and summarise here, I'd encourage you to read the article, but I think the headline would be that it's a fascinating process of very rapid change, where local authorities are struggling to reconcile 3 things at the same time. On the one hand, they've largely been subject to policy neglect because policymakers have been very much focused on the processes of actually enabling schools to become academies and some of the kind of technical issues around supporting those academies. And so there's been little policy focus on the role of the local authority. Local authorities have remained responsible in statutory terms for a whole raft of areas, and they're actually still responsible. Around 4 in 5 schools, mostly primary schools, were still maintained in 2014, and so the local authorities were still responsible for those schools. So that the local authorities are trying to continue to support those schools, to challenge them, and are tending to focus their energy and effort on the schools that are most problematic in that context. Secondly, local authorities are trying to continue to fulfil their wider responsibilities, for example, pupil place planning and looking after the needs of the most vulnerable children. But they're doing that in the context of reducing resources. Local authority education budgets reduced by about 18% between 2009 and 2013, for example, as schools became academies and took money with them. And so The third role that local authorities have sought to play is to build their new remit and role, and to build social capital in terms of school networks, school partnerships, so that schools can become more able to look after themselves. What the findings seem to suggest is that those things are in tension. Local authorities continuing to challenge and support underperforming schools on the one hand, whilst encouraging schools to look after themselves, form networks in a quasi-market system in which schools are also competing with each other, is tremendously tricky and as yet only partially successful. And so I conclude the article by arguing that now in 2015, with a Conservative centre-right government elected, very much intending to continue the direction of travel of the coalition, encouraging more schools to become academies, increasingly encouraging those schools to work in multi-academy trusts, so federations of schools under a single governance arrangement, which may perhaps give the kind of structure and deep partnership that's required, but as yet the evidence is not strong that that's happening consistently across the multi-academy trusts. And so I think the urgent priority now is to look very hard at what kind of middle tier mediating layer do we need in order to both challenge, support and enable schools to be self-improving, and what are the respective roles of local authorities and the new regional schools commissioners that the Department for Education has recently put in place to oversee the academies, and how do those two things come together? Because I think what we can't risk is another 5 years of policy neglect where local authorities are left to wither on the vine, with potentially unfortunate consequences, I think, for the quality of schools in England.